Yeah, Casey, look, the Israeli people are war weary, without a doubt. Coming up now on almost 2 years of military action in Gaza, consistent mobilizations of the reserves, and the reserves are the population. So there's exhaustion there. But, this really was the most daring military gamble that Israel has taken since the Six-Day War in 1967. And the dice are still rolling. So we don't know how this is going to unfold. And I think for the Israeli people, there is a deep fear and concern and trepidation about Iran. They look at where Iran has been going, what it's been supporting along Israel's borders, this advancement of the nuclear program. And I think to David's point, there's going to be a lot of unity of support for these strikes, certainly in the near term. But if it continues to drag, it's really going to burn out the population. Your question about President Trump, I think that he probably greenlit this strike. Now, he didn't publicly call for it. He didn't directly have American military support for it. But, there wasn't a major commitment to this diplomacy by the United States. It was more of a feeling out of the diplomacy. Steve Witkoff met, talked about term sheets, threw out the idea of no enrichment, then pulled it back, was confused on his messaging. And I think this was a test. And clearly Iran didn't pass the test. And President Trump, he didn't seem to have any qualms with Israel's strike last night.
Sure. I mean, what the president is basically saying is that he didn't buy what Iran was offering at the table. And what he's saying is that when he called for a deal that had zero enrichment, he felt like Iran's response was stringing them along, stringing us along. And there is some validity to that. And I think a big question is were the talks a ruse, quite frankly. Look, when the president says what he said just now, and you combine that with the response from Israel and the response from the IAEA, one can only assume that the goals at the talks were so hard for Iran to meet that really the United States was just sitting there and legging out these discussions. There was not a deep, I have to say this, from looking back at Iran nuclear diplomacy for well over a decade, there was not a deep, detailed negotiation underway from the United States team. Unlike in the Obama administration, we had a 300-page nuclear deal with Iran that was very annotated and very specific. And so I really am questioning whether or not there was really going to be detailed negotiations. It was either Iran, get rid of your nuclear infrastructure, or we're going to let the Israelis
I'm going to agree with that. And I think that the trigger perhaps this week from the public messaging perspective was the IAEA censuring Iran for its illicit nuclear behavior. First time in 20 years. Deeply
They're a little late to the party.
Deeply troubling. No, but what that does, that gives the Europeans cover and concern. That gives the public imprimatur from a third party that their behavior on the nuclear file has gone too far. Look, there are, I think, two very key variables to consider in this question. First of all is the changed strategic environment, the actual on-the-ground military capacity that Iran has. It's been eviscerated over the past year. Hezbollah in Lebanon, eviscerated. That was their hedge against this kind of strike that we saw tonight. That's gone. Clearly, Hamas decimated inside of Gaza. The Houthis are an irritant, but they're not a direct, massive threat. And, of course, Assad falling in Syria. So Iran doesn't have many cards to play.
But the real X-factor question here is the assessment by Israel about Iran's air defenses being down, meaning that Israel likely struck a tremendous amount of Iran's retaliatory capacity. If that is the case, then we might not see that much of a response. And it's